the matter. On Tuesday next week, the talk is online. It's a featured former fellow talk, and we're going to be welcoming Armand Duell. We're going to be talking about scientific understanding possibilities for purposes. If you want to attend this talk, please go online and you'll find the link to our website. The next annual lecture series talk is going to be given by Maya Goldenberg on the 23rd of February at 3:30 on the 10th floor. And her talk will be about myth busting or meaning making, public science communications, and infodemic. All right, so we hope to see some of you for this talk. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Brian Porter, who is currently a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. And he's been working with me, so I've been extremely lucky to work with Brian. Brian got his PhD at CUNY, working mostly in logic and philosophy of logic, but he's also been doing a lot of work at the intersection of philosophy and psychology, in part on the intuitions about reference and semantic intuition. And he's published some influential paper in cognitive science and some coming in PPR, is that right? Also on that topic. One of the things we've been doing, and that's what one of the projects that Brian is doing here at Pitt, is working on AI, and today we're going to listen to some of his work on the matter. So it's yours.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for coming. The work I'm presenting here today, Edouard and I have done together. So anything positive you feel about the studies and the results, credit goes to both. Anything negative you feel about the presentation itself, blame goes to me, just so we know where praise and blame are directed. So today I want to talk about AI-generated poetry and people's perceptions and strategies for discriminating AI-generated texts from human-written texts. So first I want to go over some background for AI-generated images and text and the work that's been done before, give some idea of why we've run the studies we've run and why we think the results that we think are noteworthy are noteworthy. And then I want to go over two studies we ran. One is a discrimination study testing whether people can distinguish AI-generated poems from the poems of human poets, and one assessment study analyzing whether people prefer one over the other, how people rate the different poems along different qualitative dimensions. And then I want to go over some explanations, try to explain the results that we got in these studies. So first, background. AI has advanced rapidly in the last few years, and there is a phenomenon in multiple domains where the AI-generated works have become more human than human. So for example, images of faces generated by generative adversarial neural networks are incredibly realistic, and in multiple studies, people are more likely to say an image is an actual photo of an actual human face when it isn't. The AI-generated images are deemed human or judged to be human more often than actual photos of actual human beings. So here's a set of images from one study, Miller et al. The top row are the 5 faces or 5 images in the study judged to be photos of human faces the most often, and 4 out of 5 are actually generated by AI. And on the bottom row, we have the 5 faces that are judged to be AI generations the most frequently, and 4 out of 5 are actual photos of actual human beings. This poor guy right here is a real human being who exists, and 90% of people who saw the picture thought, nah, it's not AI made that. And so then the question is, why? And Miller et al. Offer what they call the face space theory, that AI faces are closer to the average, and people are, among other things, misinterpreting sort of the distinctiveness of individual human faces as AI errors. They also use other cues like lighting. If we go back, you can see all of the top 5 faces judged to be AI most often are direct lighting, and images where parts of the face are in shadow are in the judged most human. People mentioned eyes. So some people's eyes might be, one might look higher than the other in an image, or might look maybe smaller than average, and people use these cues, even though they're not accurate, to determine which faces are AI generations and which are actual photos of human faces. But it's not just faces. AI art, paintings, and other image generation domains Both of these paintings were generated by AI. I typed one English sentence fragment into a model, and 3 to 5 seconds later, these were spit out. Now, I'm not saying these are going to hang in the Louvre anytime soon, but they're better than I could do, certainly better than I could do in the 3 to 5 seconds allotted. So it's made some progress. Some of you may have seen images like this went around on the internet a little while ago, this sort of spiral made out of the objects in the image. It's sort of a new genre of AI-generated art. And AI-generated art has demonstrably reached the point of indistinguishability. In studies, people are unable to discriminate AI generation from actual human-created artworks. And part of this might be due to the fact that the higher quality an AI artwork is, the more likely it is believed to be human-made. So people, the better an image is, they think the more likely it is to be human. And we can see this in biases towards purported authorship. When you tell participants in studies that a work was made by AI, they are more likely to rate it low. And when you tell them it was made by a human, they're more likely to rate it high. And there's a similar phenomenon with faces with trustworthiness. But what it means to trust a face that you know doesn't correspond to a person is hard to interpret. But now I want to move on to AI text. So images, whether it's faces or paintings, have become indistinguishable, and people are actually more likely to think the AI generations are real. And AI text has gotten very impressive. This I asked ChatGPT 4 to explain the controversy around the authorship of Shakespeare's works, and it does a pretty good job. It says why some people are skeptical, gives who the alternative authors are, gives the counter arguments. It's a pretty good overview of the debate. You can also ask it about individual people. You ask, who is Edouard Marchery? I mean, Edouard, you're welcome to disagree with this, but I think it works. It's pretty good. It gets the job title right. It knows you direct the Center for Philosophy of Science. It talks about your book. It's a pretty good summary overall. And this, in theory, should be a pretty complex task. It requires a lot of background knowledge, and writing well in paragraphs is a difficult task. But AI can also be less impressive. If you ask it where the letters are in a word, due to the tokenization involved in the creation of the models, it gets it wrong. Positions 2 and 6, that is a P and an E. That is not where the O's are in the word. This seems like a pretty simple task. I gave this task to an 8-year-old who does not know what the word epistemology means, but she knows where the O's are. It's not that difficult of a task. If you ask, I asked if this is a little bit of a trick question, but where are the ends in discombobulate? There are no ends in discombobulate. And it gets it right, kind of. It says the ends in discombobulate are at positions, no ends are present in discombobulate, which is factually correct, but grammatically atrocious. That's not, even when it gets it right, the grammar of the text gets worse. So AI text has made great strides. It's not always very impressive, but in at least some domains, AI-generated text has become indistinguishable. So Jakesh et al. Look at self-presentation text like LinkedIn profiles, that sort of thing, and find that AI-generated texts are indistinguishable to participants from actual human self-presentations. Clark et al. Look at news stories and recipes and regular stories, non-news stories, and find that AI-generated texts are indistinguishable. And Jakesh et al. Offers some flawed heuristics, some guidelines I think people are using that are leading them astray. One is that grammatical errors, participants think that grammatical errors are a sign that it's made by AI. And in fact, humans make grammatical errors, at least in their data set, more often than AI does. Unusual word combinations, or particularly long words, people think means it's more likely to be AI. And in fact, humans use unusual word combinations more often. AI is trying to be average, basically. So it uses very sort of generic word combinations and phrasings. And first-person writing and mentioning family members, like family words, lead people to think it was more likely to be written by a human, when in fact AI uses first-person pronouns and talks about family in exactly the same rates that humans do. So you have some of these flawed heuristics that people are using, and that's why AI-generated texts are indistinguishable from human texts. But with poetry specifically, the situation is a little bit more complicated. Poetry is sort of a unique form of text. There's more interpretive work left to the reader than for other kinds of texts. There are different sorts of rules, and those rules can be violated. Poetry has rules about rhyming and meter, but poems don't have to follow those rules. Poems don't have to rhyme. They don't have to have a consistent meter. And so whether AI poetry is indistinguishable from human written poetry depends. And now we have to draw a distinction between human in the loop and human out of the loop. So human in the loop AI generation means a human being is involved either in a revision process, giving feedback to the model and making it do it over again, or selecting the best out of a set. You have the model generate 20 poems and a human being reads them all and picks the best one or best 5. And when you do that, when you a human helps the AI, then human poetry is indistinguishable. Whether it's haikus or sonnets, human poetry and AI poetry become indistinguishable. And in at least some cases, haikus at least, the human in the loop AI generated poems are rated more highly than human poems. Amateur human poems, not like professional haiku poets. But the situation is different for human out of the loop. If you just have an AI model make a poem and no human being helps it, then it is distinguishable. People can tell the difference, or people have been able to tell the difference between AI poems and human poems, and they're rated lower. People like them worse. They're rated as less beautiful, less meaningful, etc. But AI is advancing at a rapid pace. So what we wanted to test is whether this has changed. Can people now, with the newer, stronger, better models than were available in recent years, can people distinguish human out-of-the-loop AI-generated poems from the poems of professional poets? So we tried to make this as hard as possible. No human being helps the model, and we compare it to professional poets rather than amateur poets. And we want to know which people prefer and why. If people can distinguish, then what are they latching onto to tell the difference? If they can't distinguish, what is it that AI is doing well that is mimicking humans? And if they prefer one over the other, why? What is it that the AI poems are doing or not doing that make people prefer one over the other? So, first study, discrimination. Can people tell AI from human poets? So to test this, we got a set of 10 poets, and we tried to get a wide range. So we have Chaucer, we have Shakespeare, we have Butler, we have Lord Byron, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, T.S. Eliot, Allen Ginsberg, Sylvia Plath, and Dorothea Lasker. So we go from the Middle Ages to published a book of poems inspired by Stephen King's The Shining a couple of months ago. So medieval to contemporary, across multiple genres and subjects. We try to get a wide range of English language poets. And for each poet, we got 10 poems. 5 poems that the poet actually wrote. So we tried to sort the poems by popularity on a poetry database and pick from outside the top 10 and pick poems that were reasonably short. We aimed for under 25 lines. Our participants are going to read 10 poems each, and we don't want to be cruel to them. They have things to do. So 5 poems written by a professional poet and 5 poems generated by AI in the style of that poet. So we did not do any prompt engineering. We just wrote into ChatGPT 3.5, write a poem in the style of poet. So no prompt engineering, trying to make it as hard for the AI as possible. And this gives us a data set of 100 poems, 50 real and 50 AI. So here's an example. Here are 2 poems. One on the left, in the depths of our souls we find the inspiration that fuels the mind and gives voice to our deepest fears as we navigate life's trials and tears, etc. And I speak of love that comes to mind. The moon is faithful, although blind. She moves in thought she cannot speak. Perfect care has made her bleed, etc. Now, just out of curiosity, does anyone know or is able to tell or have a guess which of these poems was generated by AI and which one was actually written by Allen Ginsberg?
Left one AI.
Yes. Yeah, left one AI. Left one was generated by AI. The one on the right was written by Allen Ginsberg. But yeah, the scansion is not as good, but it's harder than I expected it to be when we set out to do this. I had trouble with this. So the poems, this is approximately the length we aimed for in all of the poems. And so we took 100 poems. Every participant in the study was assigned to 1 poet. So they read the 5 real and 5 AI per poet in a random order. And we asked them, do you think this poem was written by a human or generated by an AI program? and it was a forced choice. They had to pick one or the other. We asked them to rate their confidence on a scale of 0 to 100. How confident are they in their answer? And then we gave them the option to explain their answer if they wanted to. Now, in total, we had, after exclusions for attention checks and things, we had 1,634 participants. Everyone reads 10 poems, so that's 16,340 responses in total. And we got a little over 5,000 explanations, so less than a third. So I'll talk about the explanations later, but we don't want to rely on them more than we have to. So, our results. Participants guess human about 55% of the time. Most participants either guess that 5 poems are human and 5 are AI, or that 6 are human and 4 are AI. So it looks like we're pretty close to the middle, and there's no significant difference between poets. The same basic distribution applies to all 10 poets. It's not like there's one poet where people go, there's no way a human wrote any of these, or anything like that. Participants guess correctly about 46.6% of the time, which is worse than chance, but is maybe what you would expect given that half of the poems are human and they guess 55% of the poems are human. They overguess human by about 5%, and they underperform by about 5%. So they might just be guessing randomly, which would mean that they can't distinguish between AI and human poems. Previous results in other domains have found a sort of Dunning-Kruger effect, that the most confident participants perform the worst. That doesn't necessarily seem to be the case here. We can see a slight negative regression. Sorry, all of these are in horizontal lines because the vertical axis here is the proportion that they got correct, but no one can be correct 75% of the time because there were only 10 poems. And the horizontal axis here is the average confidence. So each dot here is a participant, and we can see there's a slight negative correlation between a participant's average confidence and how often they're correct, but it is not statistically significant. So there doesn't seem to be much of a Dunning-Kruger effect here, especially compared to other domains. But participants aren't quite just guessing randomly because they are latching on to something. Human responses are higher for the AI poems than they are for the poems written by actual human poets. Now, it's not an enormous effect, but it is statistically significant. There is a slight increase here from about 52% to about 57, 58%. So people are slightly more likely to think that a poem that was generated by AI was written by an actual human poet compared to human poems. And this holds for about half of our poets. So for none of our 10 poets are people able to reliably distinguish between the actual poets of, or the actual poems of that poet and AI generations in the style. For Chaucer and Samuel Butler, you can see the orange human bar, people are slightly more likely, but it is not significant. And for some of our poets, for 5 out of 10 of our poets, Emily Dickinson, Shakespeare, Lasky, Ginsberg, and Sylvia Plath, there is a significant effect. There's a substantial effect here. For Sylvia Plath, 2/3 of the time people think the AI-generated poems were written by a person. Less than half the time, they think Sylvia Plath's actual poetry was written by a human being. So there does appear to be some variation, but there is no case in which participants are reliable at discriminating AI poetry from the poetry of actual human poets. So here are our top 5 most human-sounding poems. I showed you the faces before, and the most human-seeming faces, 4 out of 5 were AI. Same here. Our top 5 most human-sounding poems, 4 of them are AI, and this is in order. So the top 4 were all generated by AI. Only one Allen Ginsberg poem, actually written by Allen Ginsberg, makes it into the top 5. And for our most AI-sounding poems, the top 5 poems that people are most likely to think were written by AI, 5 out of 5 were written by an actual human poet. T.S. Eliot's number 1, Sylvia Plath appears twice, Lasky and Dickinson are also in the top 5. So people are not reliable at discriminating AI-generated poetry from the poetry of actual human poets. And in fact, they're slightly more likely to think the AI-generated poems were written by human poets. So here's our most human-sounding poem. Over 70% believed it was written by a human being, but it was generated by AI in the style of Allen Ginsberg. You can maybe see why. fireflies in the urban sprawl. It's got some similes. This concrete jungle, that's a metaphor. It's a bit of a cliche, but for all our participants know, maybe Allen Ginsberg invented the cliche. You know, he was writing poems several decades ago. So this is our most human-sounding poem, and this is our least human-sounding poem. This is the Boston Evening Transcript, written by T.S. Eliot, a human being, in 1915. Over 62% of our participants believe that AI generated this poem. Now, I confess I am not a poetry expert. I don't really know what this poem is about beyond the Boston Evening Transcript. So that may have something to do with why participants think that AI is likely to have generated this. We will come back to that later. For now, the important point to be made is that participants are unable to reliably discriminate AI-generated poetry from real human poetry, and they think AI poems are more likely to be human than actual human poems. Yes?
Just a quick question. Who are the participants?
The participants are, they were collected on Prolific. They are ordinary people. We did not single out experts or anything. They are all native English speakers in the United States, with a range of educational backgrounds. Some have graduate degrees, some have degrees in English. We looked at education, and it doesn't seem to make a difference in discrimination. Yes. So people cannot discriminate, and they actually think AI poems sound a little bit more human than the actual human poems. So one study down, one question answered. The answer is no, they cannot discriminate. But what do people prefer? AI poetry or human poetry? So to test this, we got a subset of our poems. We picked 10 poems out of our set of 100 so that every participant read the same 10 poems. We chose randomly with the restriction that we have 1 poem for each poet, and 5 are AI and 5 are real poems by that poet. So we have 10 poems, half AI, half real, 1 per poet. And then we divided participants into 3 groups. They all read the same poem. One group is told the following poem was written by whichever poet. Second group is told the following poem was generated by an AI program. And the third group's just told, please read the poem. They are not given any authorship information. So one group thinks all the poems are written by humans, one group thinks they're all generated by AI, and one is told nothing. Now, participants, regardless of which group they're in, we ask them to assess the poem along 15 qualitative dimensions, 15 qualitative features. The overall quality of the poem, how beautiful it was, how inspiring, how lyrical, how meaningful, how moving, how original, profound, witty. How is its imagery? Rate its rhythm. How does it sound? Does it convey a particular theme? To what extent does it convey a particular mood or emotion? And does it rhyme? So we asked participants to rate these on 7-point Likert scales. So overall quality was extremely bad to extremely good. The adjectives said to what extent would you say the poem is, each one from strongly disagree to strongly agree. How would you rate the poem's rhythm, imagery, sound, from terrible to excellent? How well would you say this poem conveys a specific theme, mood, or emotion? Terribly to extremely well. And does this poem rhyme? We gave participants 3 options. No, not at all, yes, but badly, and yes, it rhymes well. So, holding off rhymes for a second, the 14 qualities here that participants rated on a 7-point Likert scale are very highly correlated. This is a heat map. Red means positive correlation, blue means negative correlation. And there is no blue to be found. All of our ratings were very highly correlated. The lowest is witty and original, which with the other qualities have an average correlation of about 0.4, 0.5, which is still a pretty substantial correlation. So it's maybe not that surprising that our results are pretty consistent across the board here. When we tell participants that a human wrote the poem versus telling them an AI generated it, the ratings go up. So for most of the qualities, the median rating for the human condition is 5, which is slightly good overall quality, conveys a mood or emotion slightly well. It's just above neutral. Whereas for a lot of qualities, the median for AI is 4. It's neutral. It's neither good nor bad, neither well nor poorly, etc. But things change when we look at the actual authorship. When a poem is actually generated by AI, the ratings are higher across the board. The median for most of our qualities for the AI generated poems is 5, slightly good, slightly well, etc. But the median for our human written poems is neutral, neither good nor bad, neither well nor poorly. And this is statistically significant for everything except original. You can see these box plots are identical. There may be something noteworthy there. I would have expected that AI, if there was one thing humans were going to do better than AI on, it would be originality. And compared to the other qualities, the human written poems overperform, but they still don't outperform AI. People still think the AI poems are at least as original as the actual poems written by actual human poets. So here are our ratings for overall quality. I'm going to focus on overall quality now because all our qualitative ratings are so highly correlated. Here are the ratings from a scale of 1 to 7. Here it's written 0 to 6. Here's the mean rating. Here. Now, using mean for a Likert scale might be a little bit fishy, but for illustrative purposes, let's roll with it for now. The mean across all 10 poems is 4.86. 5 of the poems are above average in their overall quality ratings, and 5 of the poems are below average. Would anyone like to guess what all the 5 poems that are above average have in common? Yep. All 5 AI poems are rated more highly than all 5 human poet poems. People consistently just prefer the AI-generated poetry. So the question is why? Why do the AI poems seem a little bit more human? And why do people like the AI poems better? So the first question we can make some progress on straight away. Why do the AI poems seem more human? Well, if you recall, I said in the assessment study, we split people into 3 groups. And the third group that was told nothing about authorship, we asked this discrimination question. Do you think this poem was written by a human or generated by AI? And as in our initial discrimination study, the proportion of participants who think the poem was written by a human is higher for the AI-generated poems than it is for the poems written by human poets. So the AI poems still seem a little bit more, to a different group of people, the AI poems seem a little bit more human than the actual poems written by actual human poets. However, this effect goes away if you control for qualitative ratings. So here we have the ratings of overall quality, and for the poems that are rated extremely good, the human poems are judged to be human a little bit more often. For the poems that are rated moderately good, human poems judged human a little bit more often, and so on across the board. For none of these rating levels are the AI poems rated as human at a higher rate. The problem is there are a lot more AI poems represented by this blue bar here than there are by these blue bars down here. People rate the AI poems higher, and overall they think better poems are more likely to be human. The bar for AI and human poems are higher, the higher up the scale you go. So we have a partial explanation here. Participants expect AI poems to be worse. We know this because when you tell them a poem is written by AI, they think it's worse. So they expect AI poems to be worse than human poems, but they actually like the AI poems better. And so they think the AI poems are more likely to be human because they seem better. They think the poems are better than the poems written by actual human poets. But of course, that leaves the question, why do they like the AI poems better? What is it about the AI poems that is more interesting or seems better or more beautiful or more moving or more inspiring or has better rhythm or whatever across the board? For all of our AI poems are rated higher than all of our human poems. Why is that? So here's one hypothesis. Here's our sort of initial attempt to explain this data. Well, 100% of AI generated poems rhyme in our data set, and 89% rhyme every line. The end of every single line in a poem rhymes with some other line in the poem. So AI generated poems rhyme at higher rates than human authored poems. Only 68% of the human authored poems in our study rhyme, and only 40% rhyme on every line. So human poems are less likely to rhyme, and AI generated poems are more likely to be in quatrains, in 4-line stanzas. 84% of the AI generated poems in our data set are entirely in 4-line stanzas, but only 14% of the human authored poems in our study use quatrains, use stanzas. And quatrains that rhyme, 4-line stanzas with rhymes in them, is a pretty common type of poetry. 'Twas the night before Christmas when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. This entire poem, which millions of Americans read or hear every year, is entirely in rhyming quatrains. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Most American children hear this at some point. Rhyming quatrain. I was required to read this sonnet at least 5 times in high school English classes. I think that's pretty common. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Now, temperate and date do not rhyme in my accent, but as at least 3 different English teachers told me, and I'm sure told millions of other Americans, they're supposed to rhyme. So rhyming quatrain. Common.
Century English.
Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah. It rhymes in theory. And now, granted, the sonnet ends with a couplet, not a quatrain, but the bulk of the sonnet, 12 out of 14 lines, quatrains. Here's a poem. This is not written by a professional human poet, but it's hanging on the wall of Pitch on Butler, which is a bar in Pittsburgh. It's in Lawrenceville. You can go after this talk. I'm sure they're open because there's a Champions League soccer game today. This is just a patron who wants to celebrate the bar with a poem. And what do they use in the poem to celebrate their favorite bar? Rhyming quatrains. This is just popular idea of poetry. Fun, ton, shore, door, please, tease, go, show. And it's not just poems that you see on bar walls in children's books. The most popular form of poetry in America is probably song lyrics. Popular songs are basically just poems recited to melody. And whether it's Gilligan's Island theme song, Friends theme song, the Pokemon theme song, the Beatles, the Beach Boys, Elvis, Biggie Smalls, Nicki Minaj, Billy Joel, whatever musical artist you're listening to, from the Beach Boys to the Backstreet Boys to the Spice Girls, all the boys and girls love rhyming quatrains. This is the basic structure that poetry has in American English. And so here's the hypothesis. This is just what people expect poems to look like. Rhyming quatrains, or at least rhyming stanza structure. And the AI poems are much more likely to have this sort of structure, to have the structure that participants expect. And so participants prefer poems that seem poemish. They like these poems that meet their expectations, that look like poems to them. And so they prefer AI poems. AI poems are more likely to have the structural qualities to which people are accustomed from their poetry. And so to test this, we added in structural features. I went through all 100 poems in our data set and added word count, line count, stanza count, whether it rhymed in all lines, whether it rhymed at all, whether it had internal rhymes, slant rhymes, whether it had a quatrain structure at all, whether it contained any quatrains, whether it was entirely in quatrains, whether it was in first person, whether it was in singular first person, plural first person, not in first person at all. And none of it makes any difference. Adding these features has no effect on discrimination. And in fact, if you control for these in a regression model, it actually increases the AI authorship effect on participant ratings, because it turns out if a poem is going to have rhyming quatrains, people would prefer that an AI made it. People would rather have rhyming quatrains that an AI generated than rhyming quatrains that a human being wrote. And they'd rather have, if a poem's not going to do it, they'd rather AI not use quatrains than have a human being not use. So structure doesn't seem to explain the data. So here's a second try, content. Maybe the content of AI poems is different from the content of human poems. And maybe whatever content AI poems have, people prefer. Now the trouble with this is that the content of a poem is somewhat open to debate. It's open to interpretation. One of the poems in our 100 poem data set is by Lord Byron, and it's about a beautiful woman that the speaker of the poem is in love with, and she's walking down the street and she's heartbroken, but she's still smiling. It's basically like if Tracks of My Tears by Smokey Robinson was in third person. And is that a sad poem? Is it a happy poem? Is it romantic? Is it creepy? It's kind of a matter of debate, and guessing what participants got out of a poem is tricky. So what we have is participant explanations, and we don't have explanations for the assessment study. They had rated 10 different poems along 15 qualities. They had done enough. But the discrimination study, we have explanations for why they thought a poem sounded human or sounded like AI. And so we can look at these and see what the content is that people got out of it. What content did they see, and try to get some clues there. So here's a word cloud for participant explanations when they responded that a poem was written by a human. So quick caveat, this is excluding words like this, that, the, and, is, if, and also excluding seems, like, human, and AI, because those would be the only words you could see on the word cloud if they were left in. But leaving those out, you can see emotion seems pretty big, use and make. I looked at the responses that contained the words use and make, and a lot of participants think that an AI couldn't make the comparison there, couldn't use a metaphor like that or something like that. There are rhetorical devices that they don't think AI can use, but there's an emotional content that they're picking up on that is leading them to think the poem was written by a human being. And here's the word cloud when a poem is generated by AI, or when people believe a poem is generated by AI in their explanations. Two words stand out. I will say the word doesn't appears in front of these two a lot. The word no also appears in between them. Consistently, people respond that the poems generated by the poems they believe to be generated by AI make no sense. It doesn't make sense. The poem didn't make sense to me. These poems make no sense. The poem makes no sense. It made no sense. That's a common recurring theme throughout the explanations. So here's a confusion matrix. Top row are the poems that are actually generated by AI. Bottom row are the poems that are actually written by human beings. Left column are the poems believed to be human, that participants responded was written by a human. Right column are the poems that participants believe to be by AI. And I'll color code them for right and wrong. If we look at the left column, these are the poems where participants responded that it was written by a human, regardless of whether it actually was. When they get it wrong, when it was AI, they cite emotion. When they get it right, they cite emotion. The relative sizes of things like make and use might change, but emotion and the ability to make comparisons and use rhetorical devices appears in both. On the right, when it's believed to be AI and they're correct, they cite that it's simple, that there's a simple rhyme, it's generic. They think it's formulaic. But when they're wrong, when it was actually written by a human, and it's not because it's simple, it's because it doesn't make sense to them. Here's some examples. Two participants who thought a poem was written by a human was actually generated by AI. This poem is about love, loss, and heartbreak. I feel these are emotions only experienced by humans. Only humans know love. There's something kind of sweet there I like. Well, AI doesn't feel emotions, and it wouldn't pretend to. AI wouldn't lie to me about that. This is something we may want to keep an eye on as a society. If people think that AI won't lie to them, it will. So maybe people will get used to it as they get more used to AI, but maybe not. Again, just not saying anything bad's going to happen, but we should keep an eye on this. And it's similar when they get it right, when they recognize a human poem as being written by a human. It's bleak enough to be by a human. There's emotion in this poem that seems human to me. There's some emotion. It may not be a positive emotion, but there's some emotional content to it. When they think a poem is generated by AI and they're right, it's because it's simple. It sounds like it's just rhyming words. It's not really saying anything. It's just rhyming words together. This poem seems pretty formulaic and simple. It's just sort of trying to fulfill the assignment, making a sort of basic empty poem that's overly simplistic. But when they believe it's AI and they're wrong, it's not because it's simple. Almost feels like nonsense. This person felt very strongly. It didn't make sense to me or come from someone that has feelings. Remember, this is what someone wrote about a poem written by a famous human poet. These are real human poets who are, had careers doing this. And the person says it didn't make sense and didn't come from someone that has feelings. So, we can sort of get an idea here of what people are or aren't getting out of the content of these poems. They like the poems that are about some sort of emotion, and they think that's more likely to be a human. When it's overly simplistic, they think it's AI. And when it doesn't make sense, I'm just going to guess this person who answered in all caps did not like this poem. We did not ask this person to rate anything, but I'm guessing they would have been low ratings if we had. So we've got some idea here. We've got a heuristic for what sounds human and what makes a poem likable, what makes people like a poem. The presence of emotion or subjective human experience about love, loss, heartbreak, these things that people think are only experienced by human beings. These make it sound more human and people like it better. It makes sense to them. It sounds like another human being trying to communicate to them. When it's easily understandable, people do not like being confused. I mean, no one enjoys being confused, I assume. Feeling confused and frustrated feels bad. People like poems that they can understand. And when they can understand it, it feels more like another human being trying to communicate to them. It's much easier to say, oh, this is an AI just spewing out garbage, rather than this is a human being who's good at this and I'm just not understanding. So people like poems that are easily understandable, and that makes a poem sound human if they can understand the poem. They like poems that are enjoyable. I think there's an element to likability here that goes beyond sort of what we've talked about. In our assessment study, the one poem that is the most highly rated across the board is a poem generated by AI in the style of Walt Whitman. And that poem is about how awesome nature is and how cool it is to be alive in a world with so much awesome nature in it. That's the one people like best. I think it's a happy, positive poem that made people feel good. So people like to feel good. If they enjoy the poem, they like it more, and they're more likely to think it was a human being. And some structural rhyming complexity, not enough to get in the way of, understanding, but enough that there's a little bit of, it doesn't feel formulaic. It doesn't feel like something they could have written when they were children. So here's an example. This is the most human-sounding poem in our discrimination study. That was written by a human. So this is the only human poem to crack the top 5 most human-sounding poems. It's Father Death Blues by Allen Ginsberg. Hey, Father Death, I'm flying home. Hey, poor man, you're all alone. Hey, old daddy, I know where I'm going. It's about death, which is not a uniquely human experience. Plants and animals die, but AI doesn't. So it's about some specific life experience. It evokes emotion. It talks about emotion. Don't cry anymore. I hear your groans. How sweet your moans. Pain is gone. Tears take the rest. It discusses and talks about emotion. It's relatively easy to understand. It says right up top what it's about. It's sort of personifying death is pretty straightforward. It's not too complicated, but there is some structural and rhyming complexity to it. Sobbing breasts, leaves her deaths. There's some internal rhymes throughout the poem. There's some complexity there beyond just sort of your basic one rhyme at the end of each line poetry that AI is likely to do. So this is the human sounding poem that was, or the human poem that was the most human sounding. And it looks like the heuristics that we think we've identified are more or less fulfilled by this poem. So we've got an idea of a causal structure here. This is not, we're not committing to necessarily the details here. Poem expresses emotion, poem's easy to understand, things like that make people like the poem better, but people expect AI to be bad at writing poems, so they believe the poem was written by a human being. Now, the poem being easy to understand or the poem expressing emotion might have an arrow that goes directly here. Future work is needed in order to figure out what exactly the factors are and how they relate. So for future work, to help clarify this picture, one thing that would be worth doing is testing experts. Eduardo and I are working on this, testing poetry experts, people who might be less inclined to look at a poem, not understand it, and immediately assume, well, this is just AI garbage. Or people who are maybe have more experience extracting the meaning and making some sense of difficult poems. Useful AI experts also, people whose expectations for AI's capabilities that are maybe more accurate to what AI is actually capable of doing would be worthwhile. And testing the limits of AI poetry. The poems we used were generated by ChatGPT 3.5, which is no longer state of the art and with no prompt engineering. More work going into extracting the best poems you can get out of the best models we have available and seeing, especially with testing experts, how significant is this effect, or how significant can this effect be made? And also testing understanding directly. We're kind of inferring some people wrote in all caps that the poem didn't make sense to them, but testing whether or not people understand the poem or the extent to which they understand the poem might be worthwhile, and testing over time. As people get more used to AI models, their expectations for what it's able to do, their expectations that the text and poetry it produces will be worse, might change. That might go away over time. And introducing participants to AI poetry at the start of a study. to put it in machine learning terms, I think we've shown that human subjects are not zero-shot learners at discriminating AI poetry from human poetry. They cannot do it without examples, but they might be few-shot learners. Give them maybe 2 examples of AI poems so they can go in knowing what AI is capable of, and then see what the effects are. To what extent do their sort of misaligned expectations determine this? But if you sort of rectify those expectations, will that make this effect go away? Will that make them better able to discriminate AI poetry from human poetry? So AI is moving at a blistering pace, and I'm excited to see how things work out over time. Thank you for your time.
We'll take a 2-minute break and think we have plenty of time for questions.
Here's my one.